Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa, Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan.
Welcome to a special edition of Consider This, an hour-long show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Of course, the biggest news of the day is the announcement of what the government calls the People-Centric Economic Stimulus, or the Prihatin package. Joining us now to share with us the government's thinking behind introducing these measures, we have Malaysia's Finance Minister, Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul, Tengku Aziz. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Now, this package has been touted as a 250 billion ringgit initiative, lauded by some as being huge and comprehensive. Now, can you help us disaggregate this figure, at least so we have a better understanding of how much of it would be actual disbursements?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Melisa, for having me on this show. As mentioned in the speech by our Prime Minister, the total stimulus package for the package Prihatin is about 250 billion ringgit. If we look at the breakdown of that 250 billion ringgit, 20 was actually announced earlier on 27th of February, so it's left with 230. So the thrust of this package, Prihatin, is one, is to focus on the people, and secondly, on the business, right? And people covers both P40 and M40. So people is about 128 billion ringgit money allocated for people, and another 100 billion ringgit for firms and businesses, another 2 billion ringgit more for the economy as a whole.
Okay.
So that's roughly the breakup of that.
So some of that is actually subsidies and payment deferments, right? Loan payment deferments. So some numbers have been crunched, and it seems that about only 10% of the package, or about 25 billion, or some figures say 22 billion, is actual direct fiscal injection. Can you clarify?
Yes. So you're right. There are a mixture of liquidity being released into the market. There's guarantee as well. You know, for example, the big guarantee is or Dana Jamin, a 50 billion guarantee is given to SMEs and also the big companies. Fiscal injection is about, direct fiscal injection is about 25 billion ringgit. Yeah, so that's amount of money that is coming straight from the government to the people.
Zafrul, the critics are saying that, in fact, that's not going to be quite enough, especially when that money is only going to stretch for the next 2 months. I mean, how do you address that? The idea that the 250 billion headline is much more mesmerizing than the actuality. Would you take exception to that criticism?
Well, if you look at this, this is an immediate or short-term stimulus plan, right? It is meant for 3 to 6 months, but if you look at a lot of the initiatives, it is targeted towards that time frame, a time frame of 6 months. So it's never been, the intention has never been to look at this package for it's not a budget 2020. It is after all a stimulus package. So the focus and the time frame is 6 months. You look at all the incentives that are being given. It's also targeted towards for the people and for the relevant sector, business sector, which is the SME.
Are we looking at a second phase of this, considering that we don't actually know the trajectory of the COVID crisis, the pandemic dimension of this crisis? Is that something that we should be expecting, the public should be expecting a second phase or a third phase?
No. Well, like I said, the term is about 6 months. So let's see what happens after that 6 months.
Can I come back to something you said? You said that this is a stimulus package, right? We should think of it as it's not a budget, it's a short-term stimulus package. Could I get you to clarify whether you see this as an actual stimulus package, therefore to spur aggregate demand, or rather more of a survival package to protect workers, employers, employees in the economy during this crisis?
Yeah, it's actually two-pronged, right? Firstly, you're right. It is like a survival package. People are not able to do their jobs. There's always this fear of unemployment. Many of the measures that were announced today was focused on job preservation. So that's definitely one of the focus, the first prong. The second thrust is really to stimulate the economy. So that is why it is important that this fiscal stimulus targets this group that will spend, right? Because what we want is that people spend money to stimulate the economy. And therefore, we also announced that the government, and together with the other JLCs that we have a purview over, to make sure that they continue or even accelerate the capital expenditure. Just GLCs alone, the capital expenditure is estimated to be around 30 billion. And all the major projects that was announced, even in the budget 2020, should and will continue.
Could you help us understand some of the direct cash handouts that, in fact, your critics have been complimentary about and given you credit for? Some of them only will be rolled out in April and then in May. So what happens after that? The Mak-Pias of the world, what happens to them after the May?
Makcik Kia.
Makcik Kia, sorry.
Makcik Kia. So actually, for someone like Makcik Kia, right, will get a payment in April. She will also get a payment in May, and actually she will also get a payment in June, right? So this 3 months, so a payment of total of 2,600 ringgit, of which first payment and second payment is Bantuan Prihatin Nasional, and then we have the Bantuan Sara Hidup, BSH will continue, that will also be given to someone like Makcik Kia sometime in June.
Okay, since we're talking about Makcik Kia, I also want to talk to you about some of the numbers. So in the Prime Minister's speech, he said that Makcik Kia will be saving 4,464 ringgit. Now, if we were to take a look at the direct disbursements, actually, Makcik Kia would only, and her direct savings, she would only be saving about 864 ringgit. Everything else, the car loan, the PTPTN loan, the microcredit loan, those are all loan payment deferments, which she will have to pay eventually. So she doesn't actually save, she just gets deferred. So she only saves about, almost about 860 ringgit.
Yeah. So she does save on the interest. As you know, many of the banks have announced that the interest will not be compounded, not be accrued. But if you look at this plan, right, it is to help the immediate situation, right? It is to ease the cash flow, right? I think at the end of the day, what is important is we get people like Makcik Kia and her husband and the son that just graduated to have food on the table, right? So cash flow, the liquidity of the cash flow of a household is very important. So that was the main focus. Was not so much to make money, right? It's for survival. Right.
Can we talk a little bit about the schemes that you have to make sure that jobs are not lost? One of them has businesses that can prove that they've actually lost income to get a subsidy in terms of wages. Now, does your critics again are saying that that's not be enough. Pakatan Harapan is suggesting 1,200 rather than 600. The question is, in that whole kind of initiative, is the foreign worker, who are significant in numbers in our economy, factored in? Will companies be able to claim on the basis of foreign workers employed?
Yep. So if we look at the announcement of wage subsidy, we have done some work on this, albeit given a short time frame. If you look, we are looking at companies that have performed worse than 50%. Performance have gone down by 50%. The subsidy given are for those employees with wage or salary below 4,000, and they'll get a 600. The reason why we use that 600 as a basis is because we have a minimum wage of 1,200, right? So that is 50% of that minimum wage, and that will cost the government around 5.9 billion ringgit, and this will have an targeted in terms of number of employees, about 3.5 million employees, right? So we will see how that goes. But
I mean, I think this is a great program, the wage subsidy program, but I'm a little confused as to how it compares to the employment retention program. Can you clarify? Yes. Is it the same?
Yes. So employment retention program is for employees who are on unpaid leave. So as you have heard, there are various industries that are badly hit, one being the airline industry, that they have asked their staff to be on unpaid leave. So this scheme, which was announced earlier, but also part of this package, will allow the employer to keep the staff and we will then subsidize the salary of that staff. Right?
Okay. So the ERP is a 6 months program, but the wage subsidy program is only for 3 months, yes?
For now, it's for 3 months, yes.
Could you help us understand? I understand it, as you've already suggested, it's taken, you've been given a very short amount of time to roll this out and in terms of doing the research and such. How will you monitor the effects of this package in order to tweak it as it goes along? I mean, do you have the capacity to do that kind of monitoring?
Yes. Yes, I think that's a very good question. It's something that the Prime Minister also mentioned in his speech. It's something that we at Ministry of Finance, of course the government as well, thinks of very seriously. Execution is going to be key. A division or a unit called Laksana within the Ministry of Finance has been set up. We are going to not just monitor what's happening, but we are going to make sure that execution is done. Delivery is important. We have learned from the past that all the planning, the success of any idea is all about the execution of that idea.
We definitely want to talk more about the delivery and the execution of this package. Also, how it will be funded. That's all coming up next on Consider This, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here tonight, and we're speaking to the Finance Minister, Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Tengku Abdul Aziz, about the newly announced Prihatin package. So my question is how it's going to be funded, because if you mentioned just now the direct fiscal injection is around 25 billion ringgit. Now, where is this going to come from? Is it going to be reallocated from within government, or are you looking at borrowing, drawing from contingency fund? Where is it going to come from?
Yeah. So there will be a bit on reallocation of the funds within the ministries, within the government. That will probably be about 2 to 3 billion ringgit. There will be the rest will be funded through a mixture of what we already have within the government ecosystem, right? And the remainder will be partly will be done through borrowings. So you will see our budget deficit going up. If you remember, in the budget 2020, the deficit was projected to be around 3.2%, and today, based on the fiscal stimulus plan, fiscal stimulus Prihatin, the budget deficit is forecasted to be around 4%.
Okay, so the deficit is likely to go up to 4% in your projections. You said a mixture of borrowing and from within government. Can you clarify exactly where from within government specifically?
Yeah. So we have, obviously, within the government ecosystem, I call it, because we have the various agencies, the various subsidiaries, that are within that government ecosystem, which are able to give, to release some money, either through dividends, or, like I said, through borrowings.
Zafrul, can you explain in terms of revenue, because this is all happening in the backdrop of falling crude prices and so on and so forth, Is the government strapped for cash at this point in time? Is it going to be actually quite painful for you at the ministry to kind of do this, the shuffling around and reallocation?
No, I think one misconception you may have is on the liquidity position of the country. So the liquidity is there, it's ample, right? And if you look at where we are today, there won't be any issue in addressing some of the funding needs that we have just announced today. If you look at basically the fiscal position of the country, the most impact, you're right, the revenue is impacted by the oil price, right? We had in the earlier budget in 2020 assumed oil price of $62, and today, where it is today, we are projecting oil price to be around 35 to 40 US dollar. So, but the good thing is the country has enough liquidity in the system to fund this domestically.
You mentioned a mixture of borrowings. I'm kind of stuck on that phrase because if I'm not mistaken, the Prime Minister in his speech said that the country will not be borrowing. Is that accurate?
No, the country will always, by logic, if your deficit goes up, obviously you are going to borrow, right? So yes, there will be a mixture of both internal funds within the government ecosystem. Like I said, it could be in the form of dividends, a payout from the various agencies and subsidies that we own, right? And also a combination of borrowings that we will do. But what's important is the fiscal discipline. Malaysia will always continue to fund its operating expenditure, not through borrowings, right? So that is a fiscal discipline that we will continue.
Okay.
What about the question of the ministries that might have their budgets cut? Can you actually name some of those ministries? I mean, in the kind of chatter that there is, there's sometimes talk about non-essential ministries and so on and so forth. Is there such a thing? And could you name some of the ministries that might actually be looking at a budget cut?
No, when you say it's not a budget cut, it's reallocation, right? The money is still within the system, right? And if you look at the kind of expenditure out there that has to be cut anyway. You look at the events, the travels, the postponement of Visit Malaysia here. So these are things that are not going to happen, right? So we need to recalibrate the budgets of the ministries. But what's important is something that I've always said this, and I would like to reiterate this, is spending still has to continue, right? The government projects that we have announced and also other projects that are coming, hopefully, must be accelerated or must continue as this will stimulate the economy.
Okay, so to kind of to spur spending, protect household income, Prihatin was really geared to be people-centric, households, employers, employees, SMEs.
Yes.
How is the government thinking about businesses and are there businesses and industries that government considers too big to fail and requires financial assistance?
Well, we set up, together with Dana Jamin, this 50 billion guarantee fund, a fund that will share the risk of financing together with the banks. 80% of that, any loans that are given by banks will be guaranteed by Dana Jamin.
And that includes all big business, including troubled industries like airlines, for instance.
It will look at all the industries that are affected, and minimum lending is around 25 million ringgit. That's something that we are looking at.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the tone. I mean, you're the very picture of calm, Zafrul, but there's a lot of alarm out there in the general public, and we're very early into this game. We haven't even finished the first period of the MCO. Do you expect that we might actually see a shift in the way in which the economy is starting to reflect the kind of decisions being made in government in terms of people's flow, supply chains and stuff? Is that going to be a critical point in this timeline?
Yep. So yes, you're right. We're halfway through the MCO. I think when you look at financial markets, they have probably factored in most of the concerns, right? But again, this is unprecedented, so no one really knows how long this will, will go on. But we need to be prepared for the worst. So my view about what's going to happen with regards to the economy is we need to be prepared. So that's why package Prihatin is a 3 to 6 months package to focus to get people and the country ready towards the challenges that we face in the immediate term.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the delivery and the execution that you alluded to a little bit earlier with the Team Laksana, if I'm not mistaken, right? How will the government be looking at the details of this? You know, we heard earlier Kamarul say that the devil's in the details. Yes. How are we going to be looking at the beneficiaries of the package actually comply with the parameters that have been set by government in this package? I'm thinking about the wage subsidy program. Employers who have seen a 50% drop in income since January 1st. Also, they haven't laid off any workers, no pay cuts. I mean, these are all details that you need to ensure that nobody games the system. How will you be doing that?
Well, you have to have a unit that will monitor this. So I have faith in the team that are looking at this. But obviously, you know, what is going to be key is that we have a robust process and governance in place to ensure that we minimize, any mistakes that may happen. But again, we will see. Laksana is a newly formed team. With the good news is it comprises of existing senior civil servants. They have a lot of experience in executing large projects like what we've just announced. In fact, these are the same people that monitor most of the projects that are happening today in Malaysia.
Zafrul, you know, the Prime Minister's address was that everybody would be a subject of concern for it, that if nobody would be left behind. But sometimes the emphasis is on the B40, the most vulnerable in our society. The M40 often feels kind of left out. It's kind of in the middle. You're neither really privileged nor are you, in a position of being desperate. Is the M40 truly addressed in this particular package?
I believe they are. If you look at what we are, the government is focusing on, obviously B40 is one segment, but I think for the first time, from my understanding, this is the first time there is also help for the M40. The definition here for M40 for us is salary between 4,000 and 8,000. And you've seen that we are also giving them through Bantuan Prihatin Nasional a one-off cash payment of 1,000 ringgit. We also allow the M40 to take money out from account 2. We also allow them to take out money up to 1,400 or 1,500 from PRS without any penalty, tax penalty, which was tax penalty is usually about 8%. We also allowed, the banks have been very accommodating and allowing deferment of payment of principal and interest. So these are all, targeted towards the M40.
And when we talked about the package or the measures being monitored, how will the Prihatin package be monitored specifically for graft and leakages? Particularly since, Zafrul, this package was crafted without parliamentary oversight.
Yeah. Again, I think Melisa, you cannot confuse oversight of Parliament with day-to-day execution that we plan to monitor, right? So let me assure you that we at the government, and especially the team at Laksana and the team at Ministry of Finance, together working closely with other agencies, with other, my colleague at the Cabinet, will work towards monitoring this closely, right? We also have another platform, the Economic Action Council, which meets every Monday. This will be another platform where Laksana will be reporting. They already have reported the progress in their last AAC meeting on Monday. So you're right, execution is key, and we at Laksana, together with my colleagues at Ministry of Finance, will ensure that we will do our best to get people, to get the money to the right people.
And lastly, the questions around everybody in some sense having to make a sacrifice, right? And that there needs to be a national consensus. Do you expect Parliament to be in session in I think May, that it was scheduled, or even brought forward in order to kind of create that national consensus through dialogue at a parliamentary level?
That, I think, is a question that you've asked the Prime Minister.
Okay, well, we might have to put that question to him. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, this evening, and sharing those insights, helping us clarify some of the confusion out there regarding the Prihatin package. I really appreciate your time on this. Thank you, Zafrul. All right, we're going to take a quick break and return after this with more analysis on the Prihatin package. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Looks so calm. Welcome back to Consider This. This is a special hour-long edition of the show. We were halfway through, and joining us now on the line, we have Dr. Sharaad, World Bank Group Representative to Malaysia. Hello and good evening. Welcome to the show. Could I get your initial thoughts on the measures that were announced by the Prime Minister earlier and how that compares to similar economies and how they're dealing with the COVID pandemic?
Well, good evening, Melisa and Sharaad, and thank you for having me on the program. Allow me first to commend the government and the Prime Minister for issuing the second stimulus package to address the impact of COVID-19 on the Malaysian economy. Many other countries, as you know, have announced similar stimulus packages, and all of them, in varying degrees, try to give enough support to the healthcare system to ensure it is ready to treat the expected number of COVID-19 cases, which also includes additional resources to the medical and frontline responders. And we see this here in Malaysia with the 500 million ringgit going to the Ministry of Health and the 1 billion ringgits going to the purchase of medical equipment. They also try to provide social assistance to vulnerable households and individuals who are most affected by the economic downturn like this one, and to support businesses that are struggling to keep afloat, especially SMEs, with the aim of helping them retain their employees and keep operational. They also try to the extent possible, to ensure there's enough liquidity in the financial system so that it can help households and firms to smoothen their consumption patterns during times of crisis. And in the context of firms, obviously, to help them retain employees and to keep them operational. Now, in our view, this stimulus package contains these very elements and is therefore a welcome policy initiative by the government. Yet at the same time, we would also say that the package implicitly assumes that the crisis will pass within the next 3 to 6 months. If this is not the case, then perhaps additional stimulus measures may be needed. There are also thoughts that the relatively modest size of the wage subsidies may not be enough to prevent the layoff by firms with weaker balance sheets or during a prolonged period of restricted activity. There's also a heavy reliance in the package, as was mentioned in your program, on financial sector measures, on drawing down individuals' own retirement accounts and the relatively limited reliance on direct fiscal measures. And this perhaps reflects Malaysia's comparatively weak fiscal position entering into the crisis, and as well as the challenge of, as you know, of lower oil prices, which erode revenues.
Right.
If either the MCO or the impact of COVID-19 proves to be longer than expected, maybe a third round economic stimulus package may be needed, as I just mentioned. Now, the options here would include reallocating resources from the development budget to support additional operating expenditures and transfers, perhaps seeking additional special dividends from GLCs or increasing fiscal deficit spending. But overall, we think it is a welcome and timely policy initiative, but there are a few issues that probably warrant further thinking and analysis.
Firas, many Malaysians expect a lot from their government, and we often don't understand the limitations or constraints on government to act. Could you help us understand, especially if you could draw some examples? I mean, the different capacities that different countries have. Malaysia's capacity, is this package matching that? Is it commensurate with our capacity? You were talking about a rather modest wage subsidy, not commensurate, are you saying, with our capacity?
So, I mean, overall, when you look at the size of the package as a percentage of GDP, it's quite large. It's larger than the Singaporean package, the UK, the US, as a percentage of GDP. I think the problem, too, is, Sharaad, the uncertainty. There's naturally so much uncertainty around the longevity and the severity of this international public health and this international economic crisis. So there are two crises at the same time. And what started out as a localized epidemic in China, creating a large supply shock, is now transformed into a global pandemic, creating supply shocks and demand shocks in many countries around the world. And this situation, as you know, also comes on the back of slowing economic growth last year due to trade tensions, and also within the context of declining oil prices.
Right.
So in a sense, countries have had to deal with the impact of three shocks in a row.
Yes.
Trade tensions being the first, then an international public health crisis, and now an international economic crisis. So there is now doubt, that the impact will. There's no doubt that the impact of these crises will be significant. And in this regard, I just also like to mention, Melisa and Sharaad, we will be releasing next week on Wednesday morning our regional economic update, which will provide our latest economic projections for countries in the region, including Malaysia. So this will be the first time that we come out with some analysis of the impact.
We're definitely going to be looking out for that report. As you mentioned, it's going to come out next week. But could you allude to something you said a bit earlier about the uncertainty of the longevity of this crisis? For us, how are other countries thinking about the depth and the duration of this crisis, including how is the World Bank thinking about it? Are you assuming that the crisis will pass in the next 3 to 6 months?
So, as I mentioned, Melisa, I think there's so much uncertainty about not only the longevity but the severity of the crisis. And this is because of how infectious this new disease is and the fact that there is no prior immunity to it, nor a vaccine yet to use to prevent it. And it's really difficult, therefore, to contain it in many countries of the world, even in the best, even in countries with the best of health systems. And we see now the number of cases that have rapidly increased in France, Italy, Spain, and the U.S. And these are all high-income countries with a relatively strong health systems. So I think we are still in the midst of this crisis. Now, I would say, too, that there are positive signs, signs of encouragement in some countries that have been able to respond effectively, such as China now, Taiwan, South Korea, and all using different strategies. So it's a mixed picture with tremendous challenges being faced by some countries, but yet some successes in a few countries, which demonstrates that it can be tackled, but it will require a lot of determination, energy, public compliance, and effective policy measures. And on policy, there seems to be some early conclusions arising from the crisis. And one is that containment and macroeconomic policies work best when they work together, hand in hand, and it's not a dichotomous, choice, either or. Right. Secondly, health capacity needs to be surged urgently in many systems just to be able to absorb the number of cases that will be needed to go into hospital and to receive intensive care. And third, fiscal and monetary policies at times need to be recasted within the context of COVID-19. You can't expect, an expansionary fiscal policy to increase output and increase employment when everyone is required to stay at home. I think the intention there would be to keep them employed to the extent possible. And there are some other policy conclusions that we are arriving at, but it's quite clear that we don't really know how long this is going to play out because of the uncertainties I mentioned. But it's good that countries do their best to prepare for the worst. But
if I could ask you,
in making.
Right.
Sure,
in terms of, what observers are saying is that, crises like this often show up the structural inequalities. They show up, in the case of Malaysia, maybe the lack of resilience among a large number of the population. Can you just drawing on in what has been, the last couple of weeks now, any conclusions from what you see happening? The lack of capacity among individual Malaysians, the B40s we like to call them, to withstand a shock like this?
Yes, for sure. I mean, shocks like this do test resilience and the stamina of the system and communities and individuals. That's why I think it's very important for the government, the state and society and everyone to pull together and make sure that there is compliance with the restriction policies in place. I think, the big costs on the economy come from two things. The preventive behavior by individuals and everyone not to actually contract this disease. So that's, and then you have these transmission control policies set in by the government. Now, for that to work, everyone has to comply. So then you're able then to open up the economy, but only once you have a handle on the health crisis and the number of infections. And as we've seen in Malaysia, the infections, the daily increase is still there on the order of 100 to 200 cases. And so I think more has to be done to ensure that transmission is controlled, and then those who need healthcare services can find them in the health facilities here in Malaysia, either in the public or private sector. And I did note in the notice in the speech by the Prime Minister, there was reference to ensuring that there was enough capacity in both the public and private sectors.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. That was Dr. Sharaad from the World Bank. We're going to take a quick break. After this, we're going to be back and be speaking to YB Wong Chen, MP for Subang. So stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us on Consider This. This is a special edition. We're looking at the Prihatin package. Sharaad, Kuttan and I, Melisa, Idris are here. We're going to be speaking to YB Wong Chen, MP for Subang, who's joining us on the line now. Good evening, Wong Chen. Share your initial thoughts with us. How are you reading the Prihatin package that's just been announced?
Well, the numbers are a bit strange in the sense that they claim this to be a 250 billion package. On paper, it looks like 250 billion, but in actual fact, the spending is about 25 billion in real cash injection terms. And to give proper context to it, I mean, our GDP is 1.6 trillion. So if it's truly 250 billion, then we are ahead of the curve around the world in the sense that we're spending 16% of GDP. Singapore, our neighbor, considered, the standard bearer in Southeast Asia is only spending 11%. So we really have to relook the numbers and get down to the truth of the matter. And to the Prime Minister's credit, he did mention that the actual cash injection in his speech is only 25 billion. So that represents 1.6% of GDP. So those are my big numbers comments.
Okay.
Why would you discount the other components of the package? I mean, why are they not as significant as the fiscal injection that amounts to about 25 billion?
Yeah, the cash injection is important for consumer consumption. I mean, that's the key point. The injection gives money directly to the people through the welfare injection, about, if I recall, about 12 billion or so. And then the wage support, which is about another 6 billion. Those are real things, I mean, they're actually physically handing it to people to be used to keep the domestic economy going through consumption and to retain jobs. I mean, those are the real things. The others, whether it's a moratorium on loans, whether it's government guarantees, those are a bit more tricky. They come in at a much later stage. What we need to do now is to ensure that the consumers and the general population at large have enough money to spend. And that's the key point. Of course, I respect that they have fiscal challenges. But, they really need to get this right. And I think, not overblowing the issue and saying that we're spending 16% of GDP, just getting down to the real bricks and mortar and just looking at the actual numbers, I think, will give more confidence to the public overall.
Yeah, well, I take your point about the mesmerizing effect of that $250 billion claim that's kind of front and center in terms of much of the media. But when you don't have to pay a loan, it does, in fact, translate into having more cash in your pocket, does it not?
That is for the cash flow of the corporations in particular. I think some people, of course, if they don't have to pay their credit card loan or this gets deferred into a term loan or their car loans, eventually they have to pay it. This is not a write-off. So the question is, if you're trying to help corporations, why are you trying to help them? In big macroeconomic terms, you're trying to help the corporations to retain workers and to make sure the workers continue to have pay, so that the money can go back to the economy and start consuming. If people lose jobs, and then we're into real situation. Having said that, 25 billion is not a small amount. I was very surprised that the government has committed 25 billion in direct injection for a period of 2 to 3 months. 2 months for welfare, 3 months for the wage support subsidy scheme. So I'm not making fun of the government. I'm just saying that being more transparent and more honest about the numbers is probably a good thing.
Right. Well, I take your point about the worker protection for companies, for businesses, right? So this is to help companies stay afloat so that they can, in turn, help workers stay afloat and households stay afloat. Do you think, though, Wong Chen, that this is going to be enough to keep businesses afloat during this difficult time? Because, we're talking about all of this against the backdrop of a slowing global economy, against, falling global demand.
You're right. There's a revenue problem. I mean, globally, even if you are exporting or you are still manufacturing, even though you're under MCO, some electronic industries have been given the exemption from MCO. So even though if you're doing this and you're still running, the actual revenue has dropped dramatically. And if we look at the China numbers coming in, the impact is close to about 30-something% for Chinese factories in terms of their revenue and profitability over the last 2 to 3 months. So we do expect this to happen and to slow down. But it's about question of how to distribute this money, that is 25 billion. My main beef is I think the government will do much better if they transfer the money, the bigger bulk of the money, through wage support subsidies rather than direct handouts to people. Because by doing that, you could actually protect and ensure that people do not remove or do not sack people, workers, over this period of 2 to 3 months that we're looking at.
And would that include the large foreign worker population? Are you suggesting, and if I understand correctly, the Pakatan Harapan statement on this package suggests a wage support of about 1,200 ringgit. Now, would that go to the foreign worker population as well?
I think there is no distinguishing point that the government has made. What we know is foreign workers tend to earn about 1,200 or...
We've just lost the audio. Wong Chen, are you there? We're gonna try and get Wong Chen back and try and connect that audio once again. But very interesting point, because the Pakatan Harapan has actually released a statement in responding to the Prihatin package, and some of the main issues that they've pointed out is that at first they commended the bipartisan conciliatory approach. However, they have pointed out that for this fictional character Makcik Kia, who represents the average Malaysian, what happens to her after 2 months? So this is a 2-time cash handout, but what happens after that? Is she left to fend for herself after 2 months?
Yeah, in fact, that statement, Melisa, had many other points. Like you say, they do commend the Prime Minister. They bring up his last paragraph to the top of their statement in terms of, how he framed the political character of this particular crisis. He says, you might not have voted for me, but this is a government for all of you. They do ask some, I think, very interesting questions that we need answers to, like in terms of the reallocation of ministry budgets. They say, where will spending cuts be made? Now, that's not been made clear to us, I think, at this point. Also, they make mention of the need for perhaps wartime coordination in terms of procurement.
Oh, what's
that's a very interesting element in the statement around the way in which a government might intervene in the market in order to secure some essential services and goods.
Okay, well, in fact, you can ask that question to Wong Chen himself. We have him back, YB Wong Chen, the MP for Subang. Sharaad had a question for you, Wong Chen.
Yeah, so, in that statement, if you could help us understand, one of the questions was the anticipated spending cuts. The other was the wartime coordination procurement aspect. I mean, that's an interesting suggestion. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Wartime? I don't understand that question. What wartime procurement act? Well,
so in the Pakatan Harapan statement, there was a call for the government to set up a wartime procurement coordinating system in order that some essential goods like masks and so on and so forth would be provided for. If you can't answer that question, perhaps you could, we could...
I have a question for Wong Chen, just to follow up on the conversation we had earlier, Sharaad, with Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul, the Finance Minister, and we asked about parliamentary oversight, particularly because this Prihatin package was crafted without any parliamentary oversight. He did say that we shouldn't confuse parliamentary oversight for daily execution of immediate operations. Now, I'm just wondering if I could get your comments on that, particularly since the Finance Minister did allude to a certain reallocation of resources from government ministries.
I understand that the Finance Minister wants to raise enough money for this 25 billion, and that he could be cutting certain costs from certain ministries. I don't think that we should intervene too much at this stage, because the main parliamentary oversight on government spending is really the Public Accounts Committee. And the Public Accounts Committee is, at the moment, non-functional in the sense that, there's been a change in the government, and we have yet to resume Parliament, and we have to wait until May. So, as long as Parliament is not really restarted yet, it's going to be very difficult for us to do anything in practical terms. And we have to give the civil servants and the new government an opportunity to try to run. But we would like to be told what exactly they're doing, how they intend to implement, and that maybe we can give some constructive criticisms and support on these issues.
How much more bold could the government have been in rolling out this stimulus? Do you think it's essentially quite conservative in who actually bears the bulk of the burden of this crisis? Could it have been much bolder?
No, I think that the amount is about right. 25 billion cash injection is about right for the period 2 to 3 months. You're looking at basically about 8 to 9 billion a month, which is what we project the government can afford and should do. I'm just more worried about the aspect on the wage support should be at least 2 times higher, and that maybe we can have a reduction on the side of direct handouts. Because, if this thing, God forbid, lasts more than 3 months, I think a lot of companies will be under tremendous pressure to release people, or to sack people, or to remove people, right. and that can be really devastating for the macroeconomic picture. So it's much better if the government focuses on the issue about job and wage subsidy rather than direct handouts, because giving direct handouts is not going to go very long or far. But whereas retaining jobs is going to be much more consistent and better.
Okay, I agree with you in terms of job protection is the first tier, and perhaps the welfare provision or cash handout comes second or is secondary. I want to get your thoughts very quickly of how this Prihatin package perhaps benefits the M40, because according to the finance minister, this is the first time that the M40 folks are also included. Do you have a response?
Yeah, the M40 folks are the ones that have the cars, the BMW, Mercedes, and the Toyotas that they have to pay. So they're having a moratorium on the loans. I think that's how they will benefit. Most M40s, they don't really fall under the bracket of getting support. So some of them will get, under the 4,000 barrier income thing. It depends how you define M40s, but, they will get something out of it. So it is true that the government is doing this, but M40 actually really need to protect their jobs rather than get handouts.
All right, well, that's all the time we have. Wong Chen, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your immediate reactions to the Prihatin package. It was just launched earlier in the day. Now, that's all the time we have for this episode. We're going to wish you a good weekend. I'm Melisa Idris. With me, Sharaad, Kuttan. As always, folks, stay home and stay safe. Good night.